This podcast is brought to you by Customplan Financial Advisors, Inc., an independent insurance managing general agency in Canada. Financialpodcast.ca was developed with one goal in mind: to educate Canadians on important topics that affect their financial well-being and make it readily available to all. We welcome you to plug in and learn with us. If you have questions, please email us at contact@financialpodcast.ca.
Hello, and welcome to the Financial Podcast. My name is Gary Poyer. The Financial Podcast is brought to you by Customplan Financial Advisors, an award-winning managing general agency that provides exceptional support and resources to the independent financial advisor. Please visit customplanfinancial.com to see all of the resources that are available to you as an independent financial advisor. Today's podcast will be somewhat unique for us because we'll be focusing our attention on a book, namely The Wealthy Buddhist, written by well-known author and public speaker Rod Burylo. And we're once again blessed to have with us Mr. Rod Burylo. Welcome, Rod.
Hello, Gary. Good to see you again.
Well, nice to see you. Rod, I said you're a well-known author and public speaker, but you're much more than that. You're very accomplished. What else can you tell our audience about yourself?
I guess there's two main parts of my background for today. One is I do have a long history in the financial services and accounting industries, over 35 years. And that included a lot of working with some large, well-known companies and working with a lot of smaller startups that we helped grow, including work in the insurance and investment space, financial planning space, and that kind of thing. And I had a couple of interesting things happen during those 35 years. I won a Canadian Advisor of the Year award back in 2004, which seems like a long time ago now. And I also helped start and grow Canada's largest private capital dealership, which I exited from a few years ago, and have been working on building a couple of other related type businesses more recently. I spend some time assisting boards of public-private companies as well as not-for-profit organizations, professional associations, and those kinds of things. So very busy in the business still, but in more leadership capacities. But another part of my background some advisors find unusual, perhaps puzzling, is I actually have an undergraduate degree in philosophy before coming into the financial services industry. And my specialization was applied ethics and jurisprudence, or the study of philosophy of law, if you will. And that included postgraduate research in biomedical ethics. A good deal of the writing and speaking that I've done over the 35 years has been on topics related to ethics and business, which also includes, the book that we're going to talk about today, The Wealthy Buddhist.
Right. Okay, excellent. Well, Rod, what is the message or the main message that you want your readers to take from The Wealthy Buddhist?
Well, I guess I have a few audiences in mind when I wrote the book. One of them is with respect to, let's say, a younger clientele or audience that might think that business or financial success or entrepreneurship is really all about making money, and that there is perhaps something morally inappropriate about that, and that they might be giving up some of their values if they pursue wealth creation. And so one of the messages in here is that if you think of good business in terms of ethics and solving problems and making people's lives better, that there's a lot of, morally appropriate activity that can go on. So that was one of the messages. Another message is kind of going out to the financial services industry to rethink some of its situations with respect to ethics and trustworthiness and value proposition and those kinds of things. So I would say that those are the two most common audiences for that.
Okay, well, that sounds really interesting. And I know when I read the book, there were several different messages to several different audiences. So I think you accomplished your goal. But what inspired you to write The Wealthy Buddhist?
Oh, as I kind of alluded to, I've always been writing. I've been writing for newspaper, print media back since 1988 as a columnist and contributor. And now most of my work in that area, of course, is electronic delivery for some national organizations, especially in the financial services industry. But, people that like to write always think about writing books. So this is my third book. But the previous books were what I might call more practical self-help, very targeted types of topics, primarily for the financial services industry. And this was meant to have a broader audience. So I was a little bit inspired about wanting to have a message that would go out to a wider number of people on a greater number of points. But as a person who's studied Buddhism in particular over my lifetime, I was always really interested in this idea within that kind of philosophical perspective about the importance of work, and was never really explored to my satisfaction by other writers. And I really wanted to have an actual business person with actual entrepreneurial experiences contribute to this topic of what Buddhists call right livelihood. And that particular element of the book has been getting attention. I have some interesting speaking activities coming up, including speaking at a international Buddhist literary festival. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I picked a topic that's they consider to be not well addressed in Buddhist literature.
Right. Okay. You mentioned that you have a background in philosophy, and you talked about philosophical things already. But what is a philosophy, and why is it important?
Well, a lot of people that study philosophy don't express it that way, Gary. So a philosophy suggests that philosophy is a noun. That if you go to a university and you engage with people that are in the business of it, if you will, professors or students, philosophy is first an adjective. It describes a department, the philosophy department, for example. But most commonly, I would say it should be best thought of as a verb. That is to say, to philosophize or to engage in philosophy really means an in-depth intellectual exercise into a subject area. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about what a philosophy student does or what a philosophy professor does. But, the history of philosophy, the word comes from Greek, yes, I believe it's Greek, or could be Latin. There you go. This is how old I'm getting. But the history of the word philosophy really means lover of knowledge. And the original people that were identified as philosophers historically were just intellectuals that covered a really, really wide range of topics. And what's happened over history is some of the topics kind of took on an area unto itself and began to be seen as separated from it. So, for example, philosophers were the original scientists. They're the original social scientists, the original moralists, and so on. And then, of course, we now have social science departments and science departments and those kinds of things. But they all sprung out of this verb of philosophy, the intellectual exercise of, really looking deep at what we're thinking and, getting clarity of thought on certain things. And so it's important in the sense that it's really about mental exercises and being better at thinking about things. Currently, there's kind of what I would call three broad categories of area that a philosopher or a person interested in this topic might explore. And one of those areas is what we might call what is, so physics or metaphysics. Mm-hmm. Another area is what should be, let's call it morality, ethics, everything from individual behavior to how we function as a society. And then what I would call how we decide about those things, such as the area of logic or epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. So, we're looking at what is, what should be, and then what are the right ways to think about those things that make sense. So I think it's important. Sorry, that's a long answer to your question. I think it's important in that it helps people think with more clarity on certain topics that can be important.
Okay. This may be a bit off topic, but do you think the general population are thinkers?
Wow. I think many people think they're thinkers. I don't think that people tend to approach it with rigor. I think they, generally speaking, tend to be more influenced by what other people are thinking and then communicating about. And maybe there should be, I see where you're going with the question, but there probably should be more skill development amongst people on being critical thinkers, especially now that we're bombarded with information in the social media. Yeah. And the fact that people make fun of a philosophy degree, for example, or say how, unpractical that is, which, every degree is about what you do with it. The sad thing about that is a lot of people don't get exposed to that kind of critical thought. And maybe politicians are quite happy to have people not being especially critical or thoughtful things. I don't know. But yeah, there should be more of that in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of leads into the next question. I've never heard of a financial advisor asking her clients for their philosophy of life. What value do you think can be gained by the advisor talking to their clients about both this kind of information? Like, do you think it'd be worthwhile, or do you see any value in it?
Well, I'm not sure that I would do in most instances for most people for the following reasons. I don't think that most advisors have a sense of what that question means. I'm not sure I would know if you asked me what my philosophy is, I'm not sure I would have an answer. And I write books about this stuff. So it's not the kind of thing that most people have an answer to. And even if they did, what would the advisor do with that? Where I think that you could take that line of inquiry, Gary, is there are elements that we might associate with a person's philosophy, whatever that actually means, that is about things such as values and motivations. And I actually think those are very important when it comes to interacting with a client about their finances. And so that's kind of related to that. But I would make the questions more about one's values, how they prioritize their values, what they're motivated in. And that helps an advisor decide or better understand what kinds of products and services might make sense and what things to emphasize, right? And then if the client is struggling with the decision, or the markets are fluctuating and they're thinking about abandoning some of the strategies, then the advisor can come back to those values and motivations as a reminder of why the plan is the way it is and helping them stick to plan. So less about the word philosophy, I think, and more about the word values.
Okay. What about this? And it's kind of a related question. Do you think there'd be any value in the financial advisor asking the client where they learned what they know when it comes to their financial life, like whether they learned it from their parents, and then maybe find out a little bit about their parents' background? I think that there is some merit to that. Okay. And I have colleagues out there who think there is a lot of merit to that. And in fact, for them, a big part of their, let's say, initial client engagement process includes a discussion of what are your ideas about money and where do they come from? Right. And, part of it, like from the investment perspective, that might be, going into questions about biases with respect to how money is managed and monitored and so on. But it also speaks to things such as where do the values come from, where do the motivations come from. But, one of the things I've seen other advisors do, and I didn't spend a lot of time on that myself, and I haven't been an in-person's financial advisor in many, 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 many years. I work with leadership more. But the ones that I see that take that topic really seriously, one of the things they're trying to do is get people to open up about their feelings about money so that they can make better choices going forward. And again, the ones that believe in that and have processes around that really believe in it. And I think the processes really help them. Okay. All right. The book is called The Wealthy Buddhist. So obviously there's a philosophy or an idea behind Buddhism. What is the philosophy of Buddhism? Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was so that I could put into the hands of people that maybe think that they know about Buddhism, what it really is, and help them understand that better. I think there tends to be an inclination that anything that might be called a religion or any activity that seems to be taking place in a kind of temple or church, that they're all the same. And so, for example, people might tend to think that there is necessarily a God in Buddhism and so on. And in fact, that's not true. There's no requirement for a belief in God, and some probably do believe in them in one or more, and some certainly don't. But the philosophy of Buddhism doesn't start with any of that. It really starts with a simple observation of human nature. So it's really, in my mind, a lot less like a religion in many respects, and much more like just a philosophical approach, like we've been talking today. And so that premise for Buddhism, the observation is that it's really simple, that people are often unhappy, or sometimes they'll use the word suffering. I think that's a little overstated. There's a lot of people in the world today, that I wouldn't call, there are some that are suffering, let's be clear. But there's a lot of people, in Calgary today that I wouldn't
many of us are not suffering, but yet we're not happy all the time. And so this dissatisfaction, unhappiness, being pissed off at something, full-blown suffering is a normal situation of human nature. And the Buddhist philosophy is that you can first recognize that. And when you look at the causes, this is what they say, you look at the causes of that unhappiness, they'll say that it's associated with some kind of want or desire. And they'll say that want or desire, the relationship between that and the unhappiness is causal. That is to say that if you take away the want or desire, you start reducing the unhappiness and creating happiness. And then what Buddhism really is all about is ways of increasing one's happiness. And where it began, that was the premise of Buddhism thousands of years ago, but where it grew from that was, the next step was really that there could be an obligation on a Buddhist to help other people increase their happiness and reduce their suffering, which is kind of related to the Wealthy Buddhist, is the connection between financial success, business activities, and how that serves to make other people's lives better as a premise for business is kind of where that comes from. So that's the kind of the core, the starting concepts within Buddhism.
Okay. I came across a quote attributed to Buddha, or the Buddha, I guess. And it's all that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. What we think, we become. So from a cause and effect perspective, thoughts are then causes that lead to an effect. So if I want to be wealthy and successful, I should have thoughts of wealth and success. Does that make sense? Am I on the right path with regard to that?
I'm not sure that any Buddhist historically would have gone into the thinking and then wealth and success kind of thing. In part because most people historically didn't have a chance to become wealthy. We're much more fortunate in the last 100 years or so. So a couple of comments about that. One of the things I would say is that I think certainly most philosophers and probably some Buddhists wouldn't care, whether Buddha said something or not, or if he ever said it, or even if it was translated correctly. From a logic perspective, it shouldn't matter who said something. The truth of the thing should be dependent upon, what is said and not who said it, just as a matter of point. So this idea that our life experience starts with our thoughts, I think is correct. And it's certainly, I think, a key element for a lot of Buddhists that, what starts in terms of how we see the world, how we respond to what we see in the world, including our emotional state, whether we see things as problems or opportunities, that kind of classic entrepreneurial thought does start with the mind. Where else would it start? But I would say, one of the things that concerns me a little bit is sometimes I see people talking about, starting with what their mindset is, as if that's the only thing that they need to do, that's the direct cause. What you think only causes financial success if it causes the actions that lead to financial success. So, I think what happens is there's probably some people out there who like to think that if I just think hard enough about these things, they'll become manifest. But practically that doesn't make sense to me. We need that motivation and inspiration to engage in behavior, the right behavior with the right motivations to have the kind of outcomes that we want. And if that includes financial success, then that's great. If it includes some other form of success, that's fine as well. So yes, our mind, but absolutely requires action. Yeah,
absolutely. And there was a book that came out several years ago where it talked a lot about the mind without the action. And so there's a big controversy, but that's about another book. So we'll get back to the Wealthy Buddhist.
Okay. Yeah, you can interview that person another time, Gary.
Yeah. In chapter 1, Rod, you encourage the readers to seek understanding with an open mind, or what you refer to as a beginner's mind. Please tell us why it's so important when it comes to life, wealth creation, and financial success.
Yeah, thanks, Gary, for that. The expression beginner's mind is really a Buddhist kind of expression that shows up in other literature. It's one of the reasons I framed it that way, is so that people that read Buddhist type works would see some of those references in there. But the idea of a beginner's mind generally is just to free yourself from the influences, the paradigms that you're stuck on. There's, you're you, for whatever reason, whether it's your parents or your life experience or society at large or how you're wired, see things a certain way. And if we're not prepared to kind of set aside some of those preconditions, we won't, I don't think, be fully prepared to receive new ideas. And if you're not receiving new ideas because you just don't want to, you're stuck on your own way of looking at it, you probably won't have new experiences, including accomplishing things that you want to accomplish. Maybe that's just a fancy way of saying, if you want to have new outcomes, you need to do new things. And what that probably means is you need to think new things, or at least be open to new ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. You can't have a closed mind and expect to learn, right?
Agreed. Or you can't just say, "Oh, I think I understand what wealth is, and I don't like what people do to get wealthy, so I'm just going to ignore that topic." Well, books like mine make a nice long argument that's, I think, solid, that's wrong-headed thinking, that nobody benefits from those kinds of thoughts at the end of the day. But, one of the reasons I start with that is basically to encourage the reader to set aside some of their preconceived notions about things and open themselves up to new ideas. It doesn't mean that they need to be convinced. And you probably heard the tone in my book where I regularly say, I'm not expecting anyone to believe everything, what I'm saying is just true, but I want them to contemplate it and see if there's brings some value to them in terms of their behavior.
Right. Absolutely. I know some people are very narrow-minded or narrow-focused, and it's hard to even talk to them because they're not willing to see your perspective. And that's what causes a lot of issues in our world, right? Whether it's on the political side, the religious side, some people just aren't willing to look at it from the other person's perspective, and then you end up butting heads. Well,
one of the ways I often put it, Gary, is I use a glass of wine as a metaphor. If you only ever have one kind of wine, it's impossible for you to know if it's good or not. And that's true of thoughts and intellectual perspectives. If you don't compare it to other things, one of the reasons you provide another perspective is not necessarily to convince people of your thinking, it's to help them, become better thinkers. And if they keep landing on their own thoughts, well, that's fine. But now they've done it because they've considered other possibilities and still thought, arrived at the idea that their thoughts are okay. That's the glass of wine thing. You might think this is the best glass of wine, and you're sipping others, and it either confirms that it is, or it suggests that maybe there's other stuff out there. And either way, it's a good outcome, right?
Yeah. It's like reading one book, the same book over and over and over. Like, what's the point, right? You may learn something from the book, but there's many other books out there as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, Rod, earlier you mentioned about right livelihood when it comes to Buddhism. What is meant by that term, right livelihood? Yeah,
so I spoke before about this idea that people are often unhappy, and that the idea of Buddhism is to provide them with tools to increase their happiness. And so there tends to be, a variety of different discussions around that. But one of the common ones, one of the foundational ones, if you will, is that expression, right livelihood. And it basically says that one of the things that you can do to increase your own happiness and to increase the happiness of others is by engaging in right livelihood, which is essentially behaviors that accomplish that. So sometimes they'll talk about it in terms of negatives like, don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. I always like to think of it more aspirationally, like in the terms of when we're engaged in a work activity, and that includes managing our finances and acting as a consumer and all those kind of related topics, we should be really thinking about what the outcome is for other people when we're engaged in that, and not just about the amount of money we're making or, the fact that someone buys a glass of wine from me. It's really bigger picture stuff about who's benefiting sometimes on a global basis from this behavior and who's not. So that's kind of right livelihood. And one of the reasons I wanted to write about this topic is historically, Buddhist literary figures that wrote about right livelihood go back hundreds or thousands of years. Their idea of livelihood is completely different from our life experience, And one of the key elements of difference, and there's a lot to this, and I've done presentations at large conferences, a Buddhist World Conference, and so on. You can really get deep on this stuff. But one of the obvious points is historically, when someone was engaged in livelihood, it was pretty clear what the outcome of that behavior was. Gary and I meet in the village. Gary's got some vegetables that he's grown. I've got a chicken. I trade him a chicken for the vegetables. That livelihood we're involved in, you and I see immediately what the results of that are. And we can measure if it's good or bad, right? But in a global economy, we engage in behaviors in one part of the world that, end up being energy for something that manufactures something someplace else that gets, transported and then warehoused and then sold to a consumer. And there's so many different people involved and like possibly hundreds of thousands of people in a system. How do you identify, how do you even begin to think about the impact of one person's livelihood activity on others when sometimes we never see the people that are being harmed by our business or being helped by our business? Mm-hmm. And what I wanted to do with the book was have much more of this micro up to macroeconomic perspective on this wealth creation and ethics and what's appropriate, using the Buddhist right livelihood as kind of a starting point. Okay.
So how does somebody follow the right livelihood in a global economy? Because your example
it took me a whole book to answer that question. And literally, and there's pun intended, I guess, literally almost the entire book starts from a single person-to-person interaction and moves up to topics such as leaderships of organizations. What's the role of a manager from a right livelihood perspective? What's the role of an owner? Then it goes into consumer topics. How do we apply, right livelihood in terms of spending mindfully or investing mindfully? And so, it goes off into a whole bunch of really interesting directions. I think it's one of the reasons that the publisher thought it was worth publishing is none of us had ever seen a Buddhist write about business activities this way before. And to be fair, because most of them don't ever experience those activities, right? They're either academics or they're typically involved in some functioning within a Buddhist organization that's more what we might think of as a minister, if you will, rather than someone engaged in the business of Buddhism.
Right. So you have a unique perspective because you have the academic background, but you also have the practical experience.
That's what I thought when I approached it, and that's what the publisher and some other people tell me. And so, it's a weird background that can produce a weird book.
I know. But sometimes when you combine a couple of different things, you end up with a great product, or a great service. And I think you've done that very well. Just out of curiosity, how long did it take you to write the book?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer because it's not the writing part. It's the gathering of one's thoughts part. Mm. So I, as a person who likes to write and with my brain being wired a certain way, I had all the pieces of this book had been compiling for years and years and years. Mm. I mean, I was a paid newspaper columnist in 1988 on what we called ethical investing back then, which is now morphed into the contemporary expression of ESG investing. And, so there's stuff that's been building in my head from my own work as well as reading literally for decades, Gary. Oh. But when I sat down, it probably took me a half an hour to map out the book and present it to the publisher. And then I did a single writing over the course of maybe 5 or 6 months. But one of the things that kind of surprised me is I expected the publisher would have potentially a lot of feedback because, this is what we see on television and what we hear about. There was almost no edits to the entire book. And what that told me was the publisher that and again, it's just the way my brain works. I had everything mapped out well enough in my head that it was a single write with a couple of really minor edits and we were ready to go. Now, is that a good message for everybody? I say probably not, because if you never spend a lifetime writing, there's a lot of people who fantasize about writing a book because they think they want to say something or they have enough material in their head. And then when they actually go down to sit down to do it, if they've never written before, you find it can be very difficult. It could take them years, but somebody who does it all the time, not necessarily years,
Yeah, for sure. It's sometimes hard to get those thoughts out of your mind onto paper and then organize them in a way that other people will understand what you're trying to say. As a Buddhist, how do you define success?
Well, I don't know that I really define it as a Buddhist. I don't, my starting concepts on success is really simple. Success is about setting and achieving goals, which means it's very personal. What you think of is important for you to accomplish might be different from me. And so success can be a very personal kind of situation. More sophisticated answer to that, though, I think success is really about putting yourself in a situation that allows you to do different things. If you're able to do different things, you're able to have different outcomes that will allow you to have what we might call relative success. If I want to be I want to be more successful than most of the people around me because I'm driven that way, whatever that might mean. I'm not sure that I can define all that stuff. But what that always told me, Gary, is that if I want to have a different life experience, I have to be doing different things. If you do what everybody else does, the way that everybody else does it, you'll have the same results, which is mediocrity, which, by the way, is just fine. I hope most people aspire to mediocrity so that people that don't want to be mediocre have less competition, to be fair. But I didn't want that. And as you can tell from me writing about weird things, for me, success is really about being able to express yourself without concerns or worries that someone's going to think you're wasting your time or dislike you. It also means about being able to do business with the kind of people I like to do business with. Mm-hmm. And if I don't like a business activity, I can disengage from it and all those things. So, but if I were to add a bit of the Buddhist to the success part, that's where the ethics comes in. Achieving those outcomes by harming other people or by not elevating them is not sufficient example of success for me. The ultimate success is that when you achieve all your goals because you've helped others achieve their goals.
Right. So everybody benefits.
Why not?
Yeah, exactly.
Why not?
Okay, so you touched a little bit on goals just a minute ago. And in your book, you mention or you reference competitive goals as well as positive goals. So what is the difference between the two sets of goals?
Yeah, that's directly related. So that's a good follow-up question. A competitive goal is a goal that we set and accomplish that requires another person to be unsuccessful. So a race is the classic example. Only one person can be in first place. Everybody else wants to be in first place. You accomplish that objective because everybody else did not. And that's the obvious one, but there's a lot of variations of that through business. In the financial services industry, all advisors and participants want to get paid. Ultimately, that money comes from their clients. The more money they make, the more money they're taking from their clients. Where else would it come from? And yet, we're supposed to be tasked to ensuring that they're moving ahead. And so obviously we all try to find that balance between, getting paid and making sure the client has some. But there's a lot of activities, especially in the financial services space, that set up those competitive types of goals where, the person wants to be the top salesperson in an office, or they want to win a trip, or they want to be held up on stage as being one of the top performers. And, that is not often very collaborative goals. And one of the negative things that comes from that is competitive goals set up competitive relationships. Competitive relationships, we don't collaborate with everybody if we're competitors. No. But if you look at the other one, you referenced positive goal setting. Those are the goals that we set and accomplish that for us to be successful requires another person to be successful in their goal. And that sets up a collaborative mindset. And that could be an advisor with a client, accountants and lawyers, where if you shift this idea that my success is about making other people successful, you form new kinds of relationships, positive relationships, and positive relationships support each other. The most successful people I see are people that are surrounded with themselves with this kind of, what Covey would have called win-win and those kinds of things. I mean, this is not a new theme. My terms of those things are competitive and positive goals and competitive positive relationships. But I try to conceptualize business activities that really emphasizes positive goals, identifies the positive relationships, and then works on relationship building in that environment. And that's worked very well for me.
Okay, that's excellent. Do you find many financial advisors have that mentality, or do you find them more competitive?
Well, historically, for sure, is more competitive. And I'm an optimist. I do think the industry is getting better. Whether it's getting better because human nature is getting better, or leaders are creating new systems that are more inclined to put reward on outcomes for clients. One of the challenges we had in the industry is a great number of us were never rewarded for the outcome for the client. We were rewarded for selling products.
Yeah.
And often, those products did not result in an outcome that the client had hoped for. And yet we were rewarded up front and all along the way. And, there are shifts going on out there where it's becoming less like that and more about those relationships. The hard thing for many people is that as those business models shift, it's harder and harder to get into the industry and get up and running. When I got started, it was nowhere near as hard as it is today. So, yeah, I think there's some improvements going on, but there's always room for more improvements, Gary.
Okay, perfect. How do you, in the book, you define value, like what value is. How is it that you define value?
Yeah, the perspective in the book is really based upon increasing happiness and reducing unhappiness. And that business activities that do that in the long run are more likely to be successful, whether it's an individual salesperson, advisor, all the way up through big organizations that are developing processes and systems to deliver that value prop. Okay,
so value is increasing happiness or reducing unhappiness. How do you, as a financial advisor, get that message across to the client?
Well, I'm not a financial advisor, so I'm not sure exactly what that would be, but you could, reference what you're doing in terms of the accomplishment for the client, and then measuring outcomes for that. Is the client's life truly better because of the product that you've sold them or the process that you have in place, or is it not? I don't think it's much more complicated than that.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about being an entrepreneur, because you're an entrepreneur, and a lot of financial advisors view themselves as being an entrepreneur. But what is, in your opinion, an entrepreneur, and how does an entrepreneur provide value?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right. In fact, it's one of my recent pet peeves, and I tend to have a few of them at any given time. But one of them is really the overuse of the word entrepreneur or entrepreneurship. In many facets of society, but especially in the financial services industry. And if you look up entrepreneur, you'll find words such as it's about taking risk, it's about participating in a business. And I find the traditional definitions of entrepreneur very dissatisfying to me. That's not what I think of when I think of those things. If I would have thought of entrepreneurship in those terms when I was starting businesses, or when I was contemplating starting businesses, I may not have started them. One of the activities I'm very involved in is my family and I created a foundation called the Foundation for the Advancement of Entrepreneurship. And we assist organizations like Junior Achievement in delivering a value proposition to high school kids. Sometimes we work in college level. So this topic of what really an entrepreneur is comes up much more often. And I contemplate this in the book as well. So my perspective on this is that an entrepreneur is really about somebody who's identifying new problems to solve or new solutions to problems. So not just any business owner or any self-employed person or any person on commission is necessarily an entrepreneur, because entrepreneurship is not just about being in business. It's about actively looking for new solutions to problems or new processes to problems. And so, for example, we sometimes hear the word entrepreneur being used to describe financial services people. But the vast majority of financial services people work for large organizations. Mm-hmm. They never decided what the problem was they were solving. They went into a system. They don't create the products. You can't create products. 99.9% of the time, no advisor ever created. I had one instance in my life in a regular financial services area where I was part of product creation. And that was what that Advisor of the Year award included, that kind of activity. But it's extremely rare. And even on processes, vast majority of advisors these days have very set processes. They communicate within a very narrow band. Everything gets approved by compliance departments. Social media activity is monitored. In how we engage a client is often within kind of a range of scripts that we're either encouraged or forced to use. And what I would say is most financial services people are either full-on employees, or if they're involved in a way that feels self-employed, like they're running their own business, I would say you're really more like a franchisee. And so you're running somebody else's system. Even getting out of that most of the time needs to be approved by the powers that be. You can't just go sell your book of business normally to everybody. Now, there's obviously exceptions, but a great number of people in the industry where the exits out of the industry are really regulated by the organizations around them. And it's not as entrepreneurial as we think. So that one experience, when I got that Canadian Advisor of the Year award, we created a company called Canadians Retiring Abroad. And I put it that we were acting with an entrepreneurial spirit within the financial services industry, in that we saw that there was a gap in the retirement planning that was specifically about international retirement, and that there's interesting topics related to foreign tax and residency, and how do you get it out of real estate in foreign countries, and just a bunch of cool stuff that most advisors are never exposed to. And we wanted to bundle that up in a financial planning kind of concept that included all the major topics. So tax, asset management, health related topics, in this case, relocations and budgets and all kinds of cool stuff. So we felt we were acting very entrepreneurially in a space that's not normally great for entrepreneurs. That was on the solving the problem part. With our processes, Gary, this was kind of cool. Because we were doing this independently, we were able to do classes for Canadians on cruise ships and at resorts in Mexico. And the biggest event we had like that was 150 people in the Cancun area. And just to be clear to everybody listening to this, I didn't pay for any of this stuff. People were paying to go on the cruise ship and listen to some Canadian Advisors of the Year talk about this. And then either at the resort or from the cruise ship, we would go into communities where Canadians were actually retiring. We had prearranged places so they could meet to some of the Canadians that they were now living in these locations and talk to them about what their life was like and cost of living and, what do they do from day to day. And I didn't know anybody who'd ever done anything like that. And so we felt that we had a very entrepreneurial approach to a subject area. Yeah. And, obviously we got that award, so somebody else thought we were doing something kind of different too. So, entrepreneurship needs to be more aspirational than what it's used. It should be about identifying new ways of addressing problems. It's about being creative and not just taking somebody else's creativity. It's your creativity that makes you an entrepreneur, not following somebody else, right? That's what I think anyway, for whatever that's.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But when you created the company, when you first thought of the idea, were you working for a large organization already? Okay. So did you have to leave?
Which didn't go well. It didn't go well. And in fact, now I didn't come up with it all on my own. There was a person that I met in the industry that was working for a different organization entirely, a competing organization, if you will. Okay. But we were like-minded on the topic. And got introduced because of him to another person who was in the accounting space, but also had financial services licenses with a third dealership. And the three of us, because we got along and liked the topic, well, we said, to heck with it, we're going to collaborate on these things and had a good experience. Now, I see where you're going with this, Gary. There were people that didn't like that idea at all. And they were the dealerships. I got to tell you something. I got a call at one point, and I don't want to get sued by anybody, so I'll be cryptic here. I got a call from somebody in a compliance department that was very concerned about a variety of activities that were related, including one of the books I had published, my public speaking activities, and just this wondering about collaborating with people, and that was, Gary, was one of the triggers for me. I was so proud of what I was accomplishing, and yet the environment I was in didn't seem to be as proud of me as I wanted it to be. And it was really an inspiration for me to leave and go create my own businesses. Yeah. But it comes back to that message I had earlier, is that, if I keep doing what everybody else is doing in this organization, I will only ever have the life to the extent that they allow me to have it. And I'm a believer that I probably only have one life, and I'm not going to spend it working, making somebody else's dreams come true. This was not sufficiently collaborative, positive relationship for me. But fortunately for me, I had enough success and a wife who's so supportive of my, dispositions on these things, that when the time comes, I said, I'm going to wrap up this and we're going to start some new businesses. And she was very supportive of it. And by the way, and I talk about this in the book, I was doing okay as an advisor, but we didn't start doing really well until we started actually building businesses. Right. And that's where not just financially well, but I mean in terms of our feeling of accomplishment and having a different kind of life than everybody, the most other people, I should say, is that's part of the life experience. It should be different and fun and interesting.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So you're able to use your creativity or your uniqueness and go and do something where you were even happier than you were previously.
And I wasn't especially happy previously. I was managing what I believe now, in retrospect, I was managing a franchise for somebody else with a lot of strict controls over, things that I would have considered creative opportunities. But that's okay. It's their business. They don't need to change for me. I run businesses. It's nobody else's business to come in and tell me how to run my business. But conversely, if I'm not satisfied in that environment, it's up to me to go do something about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're obviously willing to take on the risk of being an entrepreneur because no idea is guaranteed to succeed, right? So,
correct.
And
I've had some that didn't work out well. Canadians retiring abroad, we got a ton of press, books, speaking engagements, television, radio, everything you can imagine. Didn't hardly make any money doing that, and that's a lesson for another day. But anybody who says that all they do is hit home runs is probably not being honest. Like the home run is especially juicy when you've missed a couple of balls along the way.
Yeah, yeah. True enough. Just talking a little bit about the relationship between a financial advisor and a client. What do you think is the best way for a financial advisor to create that relationship with a client?
I think the right kinds of questions do that. Questions that, demonstrate the sincerity of interest the advisor has in the client or prospect, with a recognition that they are coming from, a unique set of circumstances. They might be very similar to many of the other clients, but nobody wants to be treated cookie cutter. So one of the first ways we form a relationship is by showing that interest and that respect in the person's circumstances. Mm-hmm. I think another way is by truly listening to them. I know that's the kind of thing that's said a lot, but I think, many people, when they listen to respond, that's the old saying, but especially in the financial services industry, we're all taught techniques to ask certain questions so that we get certain responses that help us sell a product we're trying to sell. Mm-hmm. And I think, a lot of people see that coming. It comes across sometimes as insincere, and the listening to be totally accepting of what the person has to say. And if the person says, I don't think I need to have life insurance, I have another pet peeve. This is not going to resonate with your audience, everybody in your audience. I speak at conferences, and very often in the conference space, there'll be speakers from the insurance sectors, and they'll be talking about insurance needs. And that expression, insurance needs, has been used so long that almost nobody questions the expression itself, that insurance is a need. It ain't a need. It's something that you want a client to think is a need. There are certainly a lot of people who, because of their values, don't think that that's a need. That's, maybe something you could come to get them to think that they want if you give them enough reason and encouragement. Mm-hmm. But, this is part of the communication. If you're communicating with the client and you're communicating and asking questions just so that you can set them up to try to sell them things that you're trying to sell, that doesn't go very far in terms of relationships. And then there's one other piece that I'm going to add, and this is really the more aspirational piece, because I have thought a lot about, relationship building. I used to speak internationally on that topic from some previous books that I wrote. And for me, this is the most aspirational relationship building activities, is what I call shared experiences. Mm-hmm. So one of the books that I've written is called More Awesome Client Events. And that chronicled event type stuff that I was doing when I was running an advisor practice. And then when I started doing client engagement activities as a leader in various organizations. And that shared history or experience, like trips to Mexico, for example, or bringing speakers. We used to bring amazing speakers into Calgary that had nothing to do with money. Everest climbers. I brought, help. I was part of the team that brought Jane Goodall to Calgary. We had a big event at the Jubilee Theater, and just. Yeah, wow, it was fun stuff, Gary. But the neat thing is I would run into clients or talk to them, and even years later run into people that were in the audience that I didn't know. And there's this shared experience that had happened that bonds people, and I do, like, literally, we could go into this for hours over some of the experiences I've had, but that kind of, once you get with a client long enough, and you put yourself in a situation where it's not just about money and there's some other connections you have in your life, the relationship can go deeper than that. I've met people in our business who hate using the word relationship. They just say, no, I'm a financial advisor. I don't have a relationship with people. I'm just here to give, watch their money, help them do a tax return or something like that. Yeah. Which is fine. And a lot of people are not looking for anything beyond that, which is 100% true. You can't be everything to everybody. But there are certain people that, the longest relationships I have is because they're actual relationships there.
Yeah. Well, relationships make a person's life more meaningful, if they're the right kind of relationship.
Sure.
Talk to us a little bit about trust, because in your book, you mentioned ability trust and integrity trust. So what is the difference between the two, and how do you establish them?
Yeah, that's a great question. We could do this one for an hour as well. I'll give you the short answer. Every business owner, every business person, every advisor has to establish one thing for sure. And it's all the same. And it's a minimum level of trust with the market. And then when I say market, it might be regulators, it might be colleagues, certainly means clients and prospects, your staff, those kinds of things. A minimum level of trust. And yet very often we don't talk about that. We say the word trust, but this is how a philosopher's mind works. They go, okay, this is an important word. How come nobody's diving into what this actually means if it's something everybody needs? And it tends to fall on the philosophers and the writers out there to say, okay, let's unpackage this concept of trust. And if we unpackage it, can we learn something that's useful? So for example, one of my other pet peeves is people in the financial services industry and others will say, we're in the trust business, or we're the trusted source of information on this topic, or, come to us because people trust us. That's not the objective. Criminals get trusted. Con men get trusted. Incapable, lazy people get trusted. And what we are trying to achieve is trustworthiness, not just being trusted. That results from marketing. Yeah. Trustworthiness results from having two states, ability trust and integrity trust, what you reference. So what is that? What are those two things? So ability trust, where we can say to an audience, trust us, I am able to do the things for you I say I can do. You've communicated a value proposition to the market, and you're saying, trust us, we can do that. The other form of trust is integrity trust. Trust, I will in fact do it. I know you can do it. You say you're going to see me, every 6 months to review my portfolio. And then after a few years, I don't hear from you because you're off golfing or, searching for other clients, or you're on cruises and stuff. That's a disconnect. You could have seen them. You chose not to. And this is one of the things that upsets consumers is, I know this person made these commitments to me. Now they're just not fulfilling it. So optimally, we need to be trustworthy in our ability and in our integrity, so that when we are trusted, we're worthy of that. So your second part of your question is, how do we do that? A lot of it is around communication strategy. So we'll give, the expression I sometimes use is giving evidence in support of this. So if I say to you, Gary, trust me, I'm able to do this, I might say, I have this designation. I have the skills. I work for a big company that has all these products and services. And hey, Gary, if I don't know something, it's easy for me to call head office and get some support. And, I can do this for you. Okay. The other thing on the integrity trust is a person might say, it's important for me that I respect your time. So we'll always be on time. We'll schedule our meetings out. You're a priority. So some of it is the words. But obviously, if you don't have the behavior behind the words, that's where, a big disconnect comes up. There's a definition of integrity that runs around part of the industry by one of the large organizations that says integrity is an alignment of values with behavior. And I like that approach to that idea because it says to me that two things need to go on. A consumer or colleague or client needs to see my behavior, to see that I'm doing what I say I was going to do. Right. But talking about your values and why that's important to give them comfort and confidence is also important. And this is where we start saying things like, hey, I have a code of ethics at this organization that I work with, or I subscribe to these values, or, these sorts of things, or, I'm going to provide you with some references from clients that will, corroborate what I'm saying to you, that I really do what I say I'm going to do for you. And so the ability trust is sometimes easier because it's more objective. The integrity trust sometimes takes a little bit more work. But we've got to, if we're going to have a long-term successful business, we've got to do more than just establish upfront trust. Because if we're not trustworthy, they'll leave because they're disappointed. So we need to build that trustworthiness up over time.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. If a financial advisor lacks trustworthiness, how easy is it for the client to pick that out?
I don't think it's very easy.
No.
Yeah. And in fact, I think for the vast majority of clients, they wouldn't know what to ask for. They wouldn't know what to think about. Sometimes advisors run around, and historically, this is changing now with things like title protection, for example. Mm-hmm. On the ability trust side, let's talk about title protection. Historically, advisors could run around with titles that didn't necessarily adequately represent their backgrounds and their skills and their abilities. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons that development has come, is on the ability side. On the integrity side, let's point to CFR reforms, where we're supposed to be, ensuring that we're identifying and managing conflicts of interest in the best interest of the client. That's the basic premise of all of that stuff, which is an integrity trust thing. Hey, I'm getting paid to sell a product, but you know what? I really want to do what's best for you. And so CFR is trying to encourage those behaviors. So historically, you're right. I don't think consumers, the vast majority of them, even would think about these things. But again, our industry is making progress, 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes, right? As many industries. But those are the kinds of development where I think, over time, it might make it easier for a client to determine ability and integrity of an advisor, hopefully.
Okay. You mentioned about the client-focused reforms. Do you see them as being on the ability side, ability trust side, or on the integrity? Because and the reason I ask that, as a financial advisor, it seems like I'm expected to do more work, okay, in order to give the client or to do what's best from the client's perspective. So if I need to do a bunch of work, do I really want to do all that work, or do I want to do something else and leave the industry? We're on the integrity side. I don't know. It's creating more work. Do you think the reforms are going to work?
Oh, that's a different question. You had this nice preamble, and then you gave me kind of a curveball at the end.
Okay.
Will they work? I would have to spend a lot of time thinking about that. Regulations that I've seen historically will accomplish some improvements, and then sometimes make parts harder. And then as it gets implemented, you start seeing gaps, and you go, oh, well, we didn't quite accomplish this. So we'll have to look over time. The premise of CFR reforms, the idea of putting a client's interests ahead of your own, is a noble idea, and it's important. Otherwise, we'll all just, in our industry, just be salespeople, and true professionals out there will continue to look down their noses at us. True professionals have to put their clients first. I would say to advisors, you can't have it both ways. Do you want to be considered a professional? This is part of the game. You want to be considered just a salesperson? That's fine. Then tell everybody, put on your card, I'm a salesperson. I'm here to sell you stuff. I accomplish my life goals by separating you from your money when you buy these products that I'm trying to sell. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as the client knows and they can make an informed decision. The money business is always a little different. Like if someone was selling me a vacuum, there's no idea in my head that they want to do anything else than sell me a vacuum. I have no pretenses that they care about, how clean my house is, or, will my kids inherit a nice clean house? I haven't thought any of this through. I'm making this stuff up now as I go along with you. But in the financial services space, in part because we do this as advisors, we present ourselves to establish trust so that we get people to open up and do the things we're encouraging them to do, which allows us to get paid. Right. And the problem becomes if it's only about establishing trust so that we get paid, without this concept of trustworthiness, the industry has a problem. Individual advisors will not be as successful, I think, as they want to be. And if it encourages people to leave, that's cool. There's a lot of ways of making money with respect to the financial services industry that do not require licenses and registrations. Mm-hmm. The financial services industry does not like that conversation because they make their money often when you become registered or licensed and you get implemented in their system. But there's all kinds of different ways out there to refer business, to work in accounting spaces and related spaces. That doesn't mean you have to have these designations, licenses, and registration categories. Here's the problem for most advisors. They get most of the information from the bubble that they're in, the companies that they work for, and they do a really good job of getting them to look at everything a certain way. For advisors, and this comes back to that, beginner's mind kind of thing. Imagine if you were the industry, but you're going to, eliminate every bias that's been imparted upon you about every manager you had and every person that recruited and trained you. And you're going to step back and say, I'm going to look at this completely objectively. Do I need to be a registrant in this category? Well, the answer is probably no. So if you don't like it, find a new business model. But if you want to participate, this is where the industry is going. And I think largely it's a good thing.
Okay, well, that's good. It's good to know. Just in wrapping up, Rod, in your book, there's a couple of terms that you mentioned. One is spending mindfully. What does spending mindfully mean?
Yeah, so again, from that Buddhist perspective of increasing happiness and reducing suffering or unhappiness, I spend some time talking about how we spend the money we make. And I break that down into 3 broad categories: consumer type activities, including services as one, taxation as another, and charitable activity as a third category. And I think those 3 really cover everything I was trying to talk about. But the outcome from the discussion is it's very important that you think about the outcome of how you spend your money. Is it increasing happiness? Is it increasing your happiness? Is it, and this is the other interesting part, is it giving somebody else the opportunity to engage in right livelihood? Okay. So if I engage in right livelihood and I make money, maybe even become wealthy, some of that money needs to be spent. The right way to spend it would be to be mindful of the outcome of that. So if someone comes to me and they want to sell me, cigarettes, that's not making my life better or me happy. That's not necessarily one of the assessments of how I should be spending my money includes not spending on things that don't increase happiness. And if the person says, well, you'll make me happy because you're buying a bunch of cigarettes from me, then you say, well, that's not really increasing happiness, in the way that we should understand it. You should go find a line of work that actually increases happiness and reduces unhappiness. So that's on the spending side. Okay. And that kind of basic logic applies to consumer stuff as well as taxes, contemplating how you're spending money on taxes. And if you don't like how that money is being spent by the powers that be, there are mechanisms for you to communicate that to them, including not voting for people, for example. And then I have a whole discussion around charity and stuff like that as well. I want to bring up one more element that I like when I was thinking about these things. One of the discussions I had about consumerism and mindfulness on spending is that sometimes we spend money on things that cost more relative to the value we actually get. The example I use is a shirt. I might need a shirt to keep me warm and present myself appropriately in public. I could get that out of a garbage can. I might need a slightly more expensive shirt if I'm going for a job interview where I'm expected to look, like you look very nice today, Gary, so you might say, I'm going to go buy a shirt that's a little bit nicer. That's required for me to engage in these activities. But sometimes we spend money on things that's way beyond actually increasing happiness. Very, very expensive shirts with brands and things like that. And so what I call that in the book, I call that the emotional premium you pay. So some of what you're spending money for does actually increase happiness, and some of the cost of the thing doesn't really do that in any meaningful way. Anyway, so it's a complicated area, but if a person likes this idea of consumerism and ethics and that kind of thought, they should have a look at that in the book for sure. Okay.
And then just real quickly, investing mindfully.
Similar. Yeah, very similar to that. What's the outcome of the investing? The current, expression that kind of, has dominated that area of thought is ESG. But, people that are new to this topic think ESG is a new development. We've been writing and speaking about these topics, like literally from me to the 1980s. The expressions change a little bit. But the concept in the investment space is basically considering the outcome of your investment beyond the financial return that you're getting. If you're making money from something, but you're causing a great deal of harm, the net amount of happiness is not increasing. it's decreasing. And people for a long time have thought about what's my return on investment and what is this investment actually supporting or making possible out there? Am I happy with that? Or really should we be having less of that in the world? Maybe I should be directing my funds elsewhere. But it's a much longer discussion in the book.
Right. And it's excellent discussion as well. Really enjoyed those two chapters. But Rod, looks like we're just about out of time. So I want to thank you for being our guest today. Once again, you provided a ton of insight, ton of value, a ton of perspective, and it's very much appreciated. If somebody wants to buy your book, Rod, how do they go about doing that?
The book is available on your regular online retail distribution, so Amazon, Noble, and stuff like that. Yeah. If you're in the Calgary area, I usually keep, or you attend a speaking activity of mine, I'll often have some books with me just in case somebody wants to pick one up and get a signed copy. So there's the online way, but I'm very approachable. If somebody is genuinely interested in this and wants to pick it out of my hand and stuff and have a chat about things, I'm happy to do that as well. And to find me, because I know that's your next question, the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. I have a weird last name, so I'm easy to find. And so look for me first there, or just Google me and you'll find some other place to get a hold of me. But if you just want the book, have a look at Amazon, for example.
Okay. Well, I got mine off of Indigo. So,
there you go. Even better. I don't mean to support Amazon over any other distribution system.
Yeah, but it's easy enough to find if somebody really wants it. So, and I encourage people to get hold of the book because it's very interesting.
Can I add one thing about the book, Gary?
Sure.
Just for the audience's benefit, because we've been talking about business activities and outcomes. I use book sales and portions of my speaking and so on to help fund the Foundation for the Advancement of Entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. And just for everybody's comfort, I don't get paid any money. I don't even have expenses covered by any of that. Neither do any of the other directors. Other than banking fees, which is very small, all the money goes to scholarships for kids that are going to university. Every penny of it directly to the kid for payment to university. So it's a highly efficient organization. So if you're wondering if you're helping me, create more personal wealth by buying my book, it's not very likely. But we might be helping some other kids solve more problems in the future, and I think that's a pretty cool outcome from that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very generous of you and your family. So
we all benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want to thank our sponsor once more, Customplan Financial Advisors. Customplan Financial Advisors is an award-winning MGA providing exceptional support and resources to the independent financial advisor. Please visit their website at customplanfinancial.com. This podcast is available on YouTube, Spotify, and at financialpodcast.ca. To be notified directly when new podcasts are available, please subscribe by visiting financialpodcast.ca. If you have an idea or a topic for a podcast or know of someone who'd make a great guest, please send an email to info@financialpodcast.ca. We'd also love to receive your feedback. Thank you again, Rod. You were an excellent guest, and I really appreciate your time. And to everyone else, have a fabulous day.
Thanks, Gary.
Okay, thank you.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of Customplan Financial Advisors, Inc., its affiliates, or subsidiaries. This is not intended to serve as a complete analysis of every material fact regarding any company, industry, or security. This presentation may contain forward-looking statements. Investors are cautioned not to place undue reliance on such statements, as actual results could vary. This site and podcasts are for general information purposes only and does not constitute investment advice and is not intended as an endorsement of any specific investment product or service. Individual investors should consult with an investment professional about their personal situation. Past performance is not indicative of future results. If you are unsure about what is the best course of action for you in your financial planning, then we suggest you consult a fee-based independent financial advisor or get in touch with us to discuss your individual situation. Our phone number is 604-687-7773.